Hello everybody. So I'm posting this video to go along with our week 6 lecture video. So if you've not watched the week 6 lecture video, make sure that you go view that first. We're going to finish up with drama, explain the assignments for the week. But this video specifically is to go over the thesis and outline for our final paper. So if you're taking the summer version of English 122, you're at a slight disadvantage compared to students that take it during the spring and fall. And the only reason I say that is because in the spring and fall semesters with English 122, you have a little bit more time to work on this paper. So because of that, I want to give you as much time as possible to think about and start working on this paper. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the thesis and outline for our final paper this week, even though paper 3 is technically still due at the end of this week as well. I want you to go ahead and be thinking about your thesis and your outline for this final paper so that you have 2 full weeks to work on it. All right, to try to give you as much time as possible because it is a bigger paper. And I'm going to just preface this by saying that when I first go over these guidelines, this paper is going to seem overwhelming. And I've had students in the fall and spring semesters and in past summer semesters think the exact same thing. But what I'm going to tell you is that each of those students that think this is overwhelming at first has came back and created a strong final paper. And the reason why that is because this final paper has several parts to it. And I feel that those parts help to give you the content that you need to not only reach the page length that's required, but also to have the content and the analysis necessary for this paper. So at first, when we first start going over these, take a deep breath and just know that it's going to be all right. We've got time to work on this paper. It may seem like a lot at first, but as you get started on it, as you develop your outline, I think what you're going to find is that if you pick a topic with a lot of content and a lot of breadth to it, you're going to be okay. All right, and I've got several examples to show you of options that you can do for this final paper. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to go to our syllabus handouts and videos page and go down to the very bottom to paper 4 guidelines. And we're just going to go over this step by step, all right? Okay, let's zoom out here a little bit. All right, so here's the big thing about this paper that may be different than any other research paper that you've ever done for any other class. In English 121, your research paper is typically the argument paper. I know when I've taught English 121, our final paper is argument. English 109 is the same. You finish up with argument because that tends to give you the most research and the most chances for you to voice your opinion. This paper is a little bit different. So what I'm going to say first is to tell you what not to do, because I've had students in the past that just thought they would recycle the last paper from English 121. And they're like, here's my paper I turned in last semester. This is going to be my final paper. That's not going to work here. This is basically a culmination project where you have the choice of either looking at fiction, poetry, or drama. Now, if you want to combine 2 of those together, like if you want to look at a book and the film adaptation of it, we'll talk about that in a minute. That's a possibility. You can cross over genres if you'd like. But your final paper has to have some connection to a piece of literature. So here are some topics that will not work. I had a student one time that said, oh, I want to do a paper about global warming. That has nothing to do with literature. So unfortunately, unless you can find a connection to it, that won't work. I had a student say, oh, I want to do a paper about smoking. Well, smoking doesn't have anything to do with literature either. However, they actually altered their paper. I told them, I said, this has to have something to do with literature. So what they ended up doing, and actually made a pretty good paper, was that they took the idea of smoking, because they had all this research for smoking and how bad it was, and they applied it to how we view characters that smoke in literature from the 1980s to now. And that was really creative. They actually looked at The Outsiders. They looked at Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was a film. They looked at a couple of movies from the 90s. and they looked at some modern stories, and it was really cool because what they noticed was that as we've gained more research about how smoking is harmful for you, and they could connect to that, as we've gained more research about the effects of smoking, they could connect that to how characters went from being the cool people smoking to actually being the villains. So I thought that was really interesting, and it made for a really good paper. So you can do something like that. Totally fine. If you've got research from a project and you want to try to connect it to a piece of literature or to a genre of literature we've looked at, more power to you. But your paper has to connect to a story somehow. Okay? So, what I want to go over now is to tell you about some options that you have for this paper. So, the big option right here, option number 1, and you're not limited to these have just been the most popular options students have picked. A research analysis of an author's fiction, poet's poetry, or playwright's screenplay history, and how their style and craft has developed over time. Last year, the big thing was It. So Stephen King's It came out in theaters, and all of my students wanted to write about Stephen King. So I've read a lot about Stephen King, but it was really cool. They all did analyses of his work. They talked about his views about adaptation. They talked about his history with writing, how it's changed over time, his writing style. Cool. If there's an author that you really like and you want to explore their kind of, not discography or filmography, but, bibliography of texts, go for it. I think that's really cool. If you, I've had students do that with John Green. They've done that with Nicholas Sparks. I've had them do it with J.K. Rowling. If there's a specific author that you really like and you want to explore their work and talk about them and how it's changed and developed and how they use the elements of fiction, cool. That would be an awesome project. I'm totally on board with that. That could be an option for this final paper. And an option like that gives you lots of options. So you have, space to talk about family history, about how they use the elements of fiction, how their writing has changed, how they've reacted to adaptations. You've got all these points and subpoints that are going to give you enough content to create the paper that's the length that you need. So that's a good option, but it's not your only choice. I really like this option too, which is to examine a controversy within literature. So probably one of my favorite papers that I've ever had a student do in this class for paper number 4 has been Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. Most of you probably read To Kill a Mockingbird in your high school English class. Harper Lee originally wrote a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird called Go Set a Watchman. And the student looked at this sequel, which was never published up until Harper Lee was severely and terminally ill. And so it came out in the press that Harper Lee had this manuscript for the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird. She never published it, and several publishers actually came after her, essentially trying to beg her to publish this manuscript. And so the student did a lot of research examining why Harper Lee hadn't published it, which short answer was she didn't want to. And she also looked at how these publishers were really like vultures. They were really just hounding Harper Lee and trying to make her to release this, obviously for monetary gain. I mean, the publishers, who doesn't know about To Kill a Mockingbird, even if you haven't read it? They knew that the sequel was going to be a financial success, especially with the tales of it being like some secret manuscript. I mean, people eat that up. And so I really liked how the student examined this topic not only as a controversy, like, should we publish this manuscript that the author clearly doesn't want to publish just for the sake of monetary gain? Should we? And she also looked at how these publishers were essentially exploiting an elderly woman who was not in a clear, focused mental state. And unfortunately, Harper Lee passed away shortly after her book was released. And I will be honest, this student's paper convinced me to never read To Go Set a Watchman. I haven't read it, and I won't, because her paper had so many good points about why it shouldn't be read. I did have some friends that did read it, and they hated it. They talked about how it completely ruined To Kill a Mockingbird because it changes your perception of Atticus Finch. It changes your perception of this character and this character. And so, I mean, they just didn't like it at all. So a controversy like that would be fun to talk about. I had another student examine the Rocky Horror Picture Show remake that they did for live action. I've actually had a lot of students focus on the live action musicals that have aired in the last few years. Those have been really fun papers because they can go over not only things with adaptation that are problematic, but when you're talking about a live action adaptation of a book or a play, for television, there's all these cool things. Like we talked last week about John Malkovich examining the difference between film and theater. Well, these live action musicals kind of combine film and theater. So you could talk about things with that, with adaptation, with pros and cons. You can examine those sort of situations. So this topic here gives you a lot of options as well that I think could be really cool. I had a student write about The Walking Dead, and the two creators of The Walking Dead comic book, one stuck with the TV show and one stuck with the comics, and so it was all about their feud and their agreements or disagreements and why the show's kind of drifted away from the book series, and it was a really good paper too. So you're probably getting to notice the trend here is that if your topic has a big wide range of things you can talk about, that's good, because that will give you a lot of content that you can edit down and put into paper form. But we're not done. So another topic that you can do, or another option you have, is a research analysis. Now, this can be how a piece of fiction is adapted. I said we talk about that here, such as film. What changes. What I don't want is, this topic's a little hard for me because I think some students think this is the easiest topic, and it's really not. It just sounds the easiest. What I don't want is I don't want a book report. I'll be honest with you all. Please don't write about the Hunger Games. I had 10 papers in one semester about the Hunger Games. I've only read the first Hunger Games book, but I can't read the second or third one now because I already know what happens. Because people chose to do this third option and chose the Hunger Games, and then all they did was just tell me the plot of the Hunger Games, and that was it. And it was such a boring paper because I wanted to know like details within it, and details about reactions and analysis and critical thinking and breaking down the elements of fiction, and the only element they wanted to talk about was the plot and how it changed from book to film. And that's exciting, but if I really want to see how it changes, if I really want to know the plot differences, I'll go watch the movie. So if you choose this option, a good example of how this option works is I had a student that looked at Batman versus Superman. And what he did was he took the screenplay for Batman versus Superman, which was written by Zack Snyder, and he compared it to the comic book series, The Death of Superman, and The Dark Knight, which draws heavily from this movie draws heavily from. And so he analyzed not only the differences between these two comic series and the movie, but he also found articles that talked about why Zack Snyder made the decisions that he made, audiences' reactions to it, critical success and acclaim versus whether it was a flop or not, how it impacted the DC universe. Like, he went into a great detail about kind of the decisions made around this adaptation and how it impacted not only the audience's reaction, but the industry's reaction as well. So it was a really good piece, and it didn't just tell me about plot. It focused on all the elements of fiction, and it also added a lot of critical thinking elements. It was awesome. So if you are going to choose this example and you want to talk about a book adapting into a film, just make sure that you talk about all of the elements of fiction and you go beyond that. It's not just a book report. Like I've said in previous videos, I think book report is kind of like the easiest genre, and I dislike it because of that, because it seems like a cop-out. It's just like, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about the plot and how it changes. You got to go beyond that for here. That can be part of it, but it's got to expand beyond just the plot. All right? And then if that is still not your cup of tea, if you want to do a more creative writing option for this last paper, you can. Absolutely. I've had a lot of students choose. I had a student that wrote a screenplay once. It was really cool. They wrote their own screenplay. I had a student write an extended short story. They wrote a longer short story. The only thing I ask is it can't be the subject of a previous paper. So if you wrote a short story for paper 1, that was 3 pages, you can't just add on 4 pages and call it good. You've got to create your own new story. But if you were torn between two topics in the last paper and you're like, I don't know which to write about, then you can choose the one that you didn't write about for this. It can analyze a poem, a book of poetry. I've had a student analyze a poem book before and kind of the themes that that author is working with. I've had students do, they really liked paper 3, so they want to do a longer extension of that. What is the longest paper anyone's ever wrote for me in a class? It's been for this assignment. Years ago, I had a woman that wrote a paper about Les Miserables, which is Les Mis, the play, and she did an adaptation. She talked about the original book that turned into the screenplay, that turned into the play, that turned into the movie adaptation, which turned into the play again. She wrote about the whole history of Les Mis, the play, its concepts, how it's changed, everything. It was 32 pages long. It took me a day to grade it. It was really, really in-depth and good. Crazy long. Insanity. So if you think you can't write a paper of this magnitude for this final one, I don't know where that woman is now. But she wrote a really long paper, and I was like, like she turned it in and it was like this thick. I'm like, So it can be done. You can go above the page length minimums and beyond, but she did basically that. She analyzed Les Mis from start to finish, and it was a extremely thorough paper. Now, if you choose the creative writing option, then obviously, if you're doing the creative writing option, the only issue is talking about sources and annotations and citations, rather. Sources and citations. But if you choose to do that, then I'll talk with you one-on-one about what we can do to supplement that. I basically don't want you to choose creative writing thinking you can get out of MLA. You will not get out of MLA with this final paper. But if you do choose the creative writing option, we have some supplemental things we can do that will give you the same amount of effort and work required by someone doing the top options instead. So if you have any out-of-the-box ideas, feel free to throw them my way in your thesis statement, and we can talk about them. It's totally fine. Okay, so you have a lot to think about with what you want to write about. So you definitely need to spend this week thinking about, what am I going to do? For the thesis and outline assignment, if you're torn between two topics, you can create a thesis and outline for both and see which one you like better, or you can toss some ideas around. Again, like I've said with the thesis and outlines, they're not set in stone, but especially with this paper, if you put something down as your thesis for paper 4 and you submit it to the Dropbox and then you change it, you need to let me know to make sure that it's going to work. Because what I don't want is for you to change your mind on a topic and start writing, and then at the last minute be like, oh, by the way, Miss Parish, is this going to work? And me be like, no. And then you have to start all over. I don't want that to happen to you. So just make sure you keep me updated if your thesis changes from what you submit to the Dropbox. But let's talk about guidelines. So this paper is worth twice as much as our normal papers. And the reason for that is it is twice as long. It needs to be at least 8 double-spaced pages. And I know, you may never have written a paper this long in your life. That is fine. But as I've said at the start of this video, I've had so many students over the semesters be like, I can't do it. There's no way. No way. And then they get me a paper that's 8 pages long and it's awesome. So I have faith in you, and I know you can do it. It just depends on choosing a wide topic with a wide range of options, lots of points you can talk about, lots of research that you can find, and the assignments we're going to do in the next 2 weeks are going to help you get to that point. So do not feel totally stressed out about this. You're going to be fine. You're going to make it. I don't like to toot my own horn here, but I know that you can because I've done it. And I've had students do it. Students that were not English majors have totally made this paper. I want this final paper to be a capstone of this class because for many of you, this is the last English class you're ever going to take. Ever. In your college careers, which is insane. So I want this paper to be something that you're proud of, something you can hold on to, something that, you know, if you haven't had kids yet or if your kids are young and one day your kid's like, I can't write a long paper, you can whip this out and be like, look what your parent did. And show them that it can be done. I want this to be something that you're proud of. and that it's a capstone of this class. And it's gonna be. So don't freak out. You're going to be able to make it here. All these options I've listed above will get you to that point. They are tried and true by student example. So 8 pages, double spaced, so that will help. 12-point font. You do need to have a detailed introduction paragraph, which explains your thesis, the goal of your paper, as well as the points you're going to address. There needs to be a section after the introduction where you explain the controversy or the topic itself, where you offer background information before you get into the elements of whatever genre you're looking at, and that will help take up space too. Give your audience some background. You do need to cite at least 3 terms. You have to have 3 terms or concepts from our chapters discussed within the text at some point. And all that basically means is that if you chose a book to analyze in this final paper, you need to at least talk about 3 terms from our fiction short story unit. Now those can be 3 elements of fiction. They can be, prose, character, setting. They can be protagonist, antagonist. You don't have to label them in your paper, but I just want to see when I grade that they're there. So what this is trying to do is to avoid that Hunger Games scenario where I'm reading a Hunger Games paper and there's only one term being talked about, and that's plot. I want more than that. I want more than just one term from our fiction, drama, or poetry units being discussed. So at least 3. You can go more than that, but at least 3 terms need to come up at some point in your paper. And you don't have to bold them. You don't have to underline them. I'll know when I read your paper that they're there. Okay? But at least 3. Okay. And at least 4 sources. So if you have been narrowly escaping using MLA in your paper at this point, you've reached the end. You're going to have to use MLA in this paper, and you're going to have to cite some sources, both with in-text citations and a works cited page. At least 4. Now, these 4 sources can be anything. They can be books, they can be videos, they can be magazines, they can be tweets, they can be emails, they can be novels, they can be our textbook can be one. So if you want to have an easy source cited, there's our textbook. They can be magazine articles, they can be podcasts, they can be a variety of different types of sources. They just need to be 4 citable MLA sources. No, and here's my exception, no wikis or about.coms or Wikipedia articles. None of that. No, I won't count them as part of your 4 sources, and I will take off points if you use a Wikipedia, a wiki, or about.com. They need to be credible, and we're going to touch base on that MLA presentation here shortly. But no wikis, okay? They need to be authentic, real sources, not just like a blog think piece. All right. Being an analysis, it should be more than just a summary, not a book report. It should be your thoughts, your opinions, a synthesis of your sources and your own words. It should be a culmination of everything that you think along with the sources that back you up. All right, so it shouldn't just be a summary or a play-by-play, rather. And you will need a MLA works cited page and in-text citations. If you're doing a, quote, out-of-the-box assignment, we'll talk about that on an individual basis, but just plan on having a works cited page where you cite your 4 sources or more. You can use more than 4, and you have your in-text citations in the actual paper. The due dates are listed for everything below. As far as our peer review goes, I'm going to talk about that in next week's video, so just hold off on the peer review till next Sunday when I get to post that video. But here is the breakdown of our grade. So your intro and conclusion are each worth 10 points. The page length and formatting is worth 20 points. Spelling and grammar is worth a lot, so that should be some easy points for you. The works cited and MLA in-text citations and citation page are 40 points, 20 points each. So there's a whole section devoted to just this. If you don't have a works cited page or in-text citations, you've automatically gotten a B on this paper. That's the highest you can get, is a B. That's before grammar mistakes or anything else. So don't forget to include these in your paper. And then obviously your analysis content is 60 points as well. So 200 points total. All right. So let's go back very briefly to that oh no, to our MLA citation presentation. I told you we'd come back to this, and so I want to briefly talk about it. So the beginning of this presentation was talking about credible sources and how to pinpoint them. And you can go back and read this presentation if you want, but the main thing is that you want timely sources, you want them from credible sources, and you want to try to avoid bias. Now, if you do have a biased source, that's okay, as long as you acknowledge that it's biased. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to pull the wool over someone's eyes and tell them that, oh no, it's not biased, it's fact, when it's an opinion. You don't want to deceive your audience, because the moment your audience figures out you've deceived them, they're not going to be happy, and they're probably not going to take anything you say with a grain of salt. So you want to make sure that if you know there's bias in your source, you want to acknowledge it. You want to put it out there in the open. So I put an example on here as an example of that. I can say, although Jernigan's writing has been labeled as, quote, highly conservative by the New York Times, I still feel like he makes a valid point about immigration reform, and one that needs to be explored further, blah, blah, blah. My point here is that I acknowledge that, yeah, there's a bias there, but I'm using him for a reason. So if you are citing a source in your paper or your final research paper and you feel like there's a bias there, just bring it out into the open. Just say, yeah, this source may seem biased, but I'm using it for good reason, and then acknowledge that. Okay? That's all I'm asking in terms of picking a non-biased versus a biased source. Site credibility, again, no Wikipedia, no wikis, no about.coms. I'm going to be real strict on that. Every semester someone uses it, and I'm like, why'd you do it? So just don't. And then finally, I want to talk about this. If you're looking at websites as sources, here's kind of a how-to on determining whether or not that site is credible or not, or if you even need to acknowledge its credibility. So a .gov or .edu site, I'm not going to question the credibility on those because they're educational or government related. They cannot afford to have any opinionated or false information listed. Now, on the downside, they're going to be dry sources of information. But on the plus side, you don't have to worry about them being credible or not. You'll just know that you can use them, no problem. .org is an organization site. They're more credible than your .com or .nets just because they're a little harder to get started, but they can still be questionable. I mean, as my example shows out here, there are a Bigfoot Anonymous organization site, which, you can take it for what it's worth. I'm not going to, get on any Bigfoot lovers in here, but you can take that for what it's worth. Now, nessieisreal.org, totally fact. Just joking. And then finally, we have our .com or .net, which is our commercial websites. Those can be purchased by anyone, and they're the ones you have to be most cautious about. Because I can go out there and do rachelparish.com and post whatever I want, and people can either believe it or not believe it. Now, obviously, there's some caveats to this. Hospitals use .com sites a lot because they're cheap and they're efficient. And so obviously those are going to be credible, but just use your best judgment if it's like Joey's blog.com, you might be questioning its authenticity. But if it's like, the American Cancer Society's website, you're going to be like, okay, yeah, that's credible. All right. And then there's some questions on here you can ask just to make sure that the site you're looking at is credible, just to double check yourself. So you can go back and check this presentation out. It's in week 1. The video is also in week 5. So just be sure to look at it. But yeah, that's going over paper 4. Again, there's a lot to take in. There's a lot to soak in. Feel free to rewatch this video to double check everything. But just know that you can breathe. It's going to be okay. This paper is always my favorite to read because I feel like it's the one that everyone puts the most creativity into. They have the most fun with it. It's the most challenging, but in a good way. I have a lot of students that are like, I don't like the poetry paper because it's weird. And then they end up loving this paper because it's more conventional, but it gives you the opportunity to expand and be creative and have fun with something. So if you have any questions, please let me know. And if you have questions when you turn in your thesis statement and outline, let me know too. I'm happy to answer them. But in the meantime, feel free to rewatch this video, check out some examples, And as always, ask me questions and watch the week 6 lecture video. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.